Welcome to Bright Old Testament 510, the historical books. This is Lecture 3. We will be looking at the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and Ruth. As we begin 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the question we have to ask ourselves first is, what exactly is a chronicle? The word chronicle is the translation for the Hebrew term divrei yamim, which means the words of the days, or the things of the days. It's a phrase that occurs many times in the historical books, and does in fact occur once in 1 Chronicles, chapter 27, verse 24. But the reference in that passage is actually to the Chronicles of King David, a book that we don't have a record of. In fact, there are many books that are referenced in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, none of which we have. The Chronicles or the records of Iddo or Nathan or Gad or Shemaiah, all prophets or seers that recorded their words. 1st and 2nd Chronicles does not actually refer to itself as 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and that term is nowhere used in reference to the books themselves. In Greek, in the Septuagint, the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, again splitting one book into two because the length of Greek will not fit on one manuscript, one scroll, the book is called Paralepomena, which means the things that are left over, the things that are skipped over. The Septuagint views 1st and 2nd Chronicles as an addendum to the history of Israel, the things that have not been mentioned. It is supplementary to 1st and 2nd Kings, or in the Septuagint, 3rd and 4th Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel being 1st and 2nd Kings. It is a supplementary account of things that happened, specifically focusing upon the temple, upon the worship of God, and upon the kingdom of Judah. So while it's historical, it's not a chronicle as we might think of it because it has an explicit agenda, leaving out much that has already come before, and yet using records of things that come before in order to communicate a particular message. So the question is, who? Who did this? In tradition, for Christians and Jews, it has often been suggested that Ezra is the author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The Talmud actually suggests that Ezra wrote the Chronicles up to his day, and then Nehemiah is the one who finished them. This is certainly possible, although nowhere in the book of Chronicles is it actually suggested who wrote the book of Chronicles. We have a reference at the end of 2nd Chronicles to the return of the exiles due to the decree of King Cyrus, but beyond that, we don't even know if that is an editorial comment that's made at the end of the book, having been written by a previous author at the beginning of the exile or during the exile, or perhaps the person who wrote that comment at the end of 2nd Chronicles is indeed the chronicler, the one who wrote the entire work. Again, the Jewish tradition gets around this by suggesting Ezra and then Nehemiah, so that some of it is written earlier, some of it is written later, although both Ezra and Nehemiah are after the return to Israel under King Cyrus, Ezra being first and then Nehemiah following up sometime later, overlapping slightly. That's certainly possible, but we really don't know. We simply refer to them as the chronicler, the one who wrote the book of Chronicles, sort of an unoriginal title, and yet it differentiates between the chronicler and the Deuteronomist who supposedly wrote the Deuteronomistic history, which does not include the book of Chronicles. The other question is to when. When is it written? Again, the addendum at the end of 2nd Chronicles suggests that it's written after the exile, and we seem to have 3, maybe even 4 generations indicated in the genealogies after the return to Israel. But again, even in Ezra and Nehemiah, we have differences of genealogies, even though the numbers are the same. So that Ezra seems to have recorded the people that were alive up to his day, and Nehemiah then adding in the ones who were born after. So it's possible that an original author recorded the book of Chronicles, and then later on the genealogies were expanded. This question of when is largely influenced by the question of why. Is the book written, with its emphasis on Judah and its emphasis on the temple, is it written to convince Israel they need to build the second temple prior to its completion in 516, 515 BC? Or is this the chronicler indicating this is why we lost the first temple, this is how we keep the second one, in which case it would be after 515. It would also be after the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, them coming later than the writing in 515 BC. So again, if we say it's before the construction of the second temple, it would not be Ezra or Nehemiah who wrote it. If it's after the second temple, then it could be Ezra or Nehemiah, but it could also be some other unknown person. So when and why and who are somewhat tied together. All we really know is what. We know that it's a book that's focused on the things that are sometimes mentioned, but sometimes left out, adding in extra detail, but also emphasizing previously possessed detail, but with a specific message related to the temple, the importance of the Davidic line, and the importance of true worship of God. The books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles each divide up nicely into the first 9 chapters and then the rest of the book. In 1st Chronicles, the first 9 chapters are related to genealogies. In 2nd Chronicles, the first 9 chapters are related to Solomon and the building of the temple. In 1st Chronicles, the genealogies are drawn from Genesis and from other places in the Old Testament, such as 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's possible, because of the mention in chapter 2 in the line of Judah and the great emphasis upon Elishama, that Elishama is actually the scribe under the reign of Jehoiakim, who is credited with recording many of the genealogies that perhaps the chronicler is using, which would explain why there is such an emphasis on that individual in chapter 2 when he's largely unknown elsewhere in the Old Testament. In chapter 1, the focus is from Adam to Abraham. In chapter 2, we deal with the tribe of Judah first, because the emphasis in the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles is on Judah. In chapter 3, we switch to David, because within Judah, the most important person is David and his line. We then fill in the rest of Judah in chapter 4, adding in Simeon, whose territory is found within the tribe of Judah. And then in chapter 5, we switch to the Transjordanian tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half-tribe of Manasseh. Then in chapter 6, we have the center of the genealogy, almost the middle of 13 tribes, if you include Levi, although really there's no Dan mentioned, and Naphtali only gets 1 verse in chapter 7. So the middle of the genealogy is not exactly the middle, but it's close enough to get an emphasis to the tribe of Levi, which, given the focus on the temple and the worship of God in the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, makes sense. We then have the rest of the tribes that have not been mentioned yet in chapter 7, and last but not least, we have Benjamin. It's not supposed to be last but not least. This is actually an important place in the genealogy, sort of a bookend to chapter 2. We start with Judah, but we end with Benjamin. It's not that Benjamin is least. Actually, Benjamin is being emphasized here. First, middle, and last are the most important parts of this genealogy. So we have Benjamin mentioned last, which is especially important because we're going to emphasize Saul in chapter 9. In chapter 9, we also have the first to return to Jerusalem after the exile, which again gives us a little hint as to the dating, although it might be the dating of the final form if perhaps Nehemiah or someone else is the one who finishes off the book for a previous author. Saul is mentioned, but it's not so much Saul as much as it is an emphasis on the line of Benjamin, because while Saul is mentioned, if you didn't know who Saul was, you still wouldn't know who Saul was after chapter 9. His name is mentioned, but almost in passing. You really have to know the story for chapter 9 to really emphasize anything. It looks like we're just talking about Benjaminites. But it does form a transition then to chapter 10 when we do talk about Saul himself, his failure, and the transition to David. 1 Chronicles chapter 10 shifts to a focus upon Saul, with the chapter concluding by reminding us that Saul was unfaithful to the Lord. We see this in his disobedience in 1 Samuel chapter 13, 1 Samuel chapter 15, not waiting for Samuel to offer the sacrifices, not killing all the Amalekites as he was supposed to. And yet the chronicler also reminds us that he consulted a medium for guidance and did not inquire of the Lord. So the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David. This is important because it reminds us that Saul was quite superstitious, and that Saul was interested in figuring out what was going to happen in the future. Not so interested in obedience or following after God. In fact, it had gotten to the point where God wouldn't even listen to him if he wanted to inquire of the Lord, but he didn't want to. He just simply wanted guidance. He wanted to know what was going to take place. There's a subtle dig at Saul here, but also a reminder to current Israel that is reading 1 Chronicles, a reminder that the temptation for them is the same, to not trust in God and to worry about the future and to consult other forms, perhaps mediums or other gods, in order to tell them what's going to happen, in order to offer them protection, in order to give them a secret edge against the Persians or whoever is operating in the land of Israel at that time. So the chronicler here is keeping this record for good reason, to remind us that the failures of Saul could easily be the failures of the people in his day. 1 Chronicles 11 through 27 forms somewhat of a loose chiasm. I'm not a big fan of chiasm because chiasm, while it's often intentional on the part of the author, if it's not really obvious, can often be something that we force on the text. Really, the advantage of chiasm is memory, remembering what's in each chapter, rather than it having any interpretation per se to its actual existence in the text. It doesn't affect the interpretation or the meaning of the text. It just really helps with recall. So we have a loose chiasm here. Chapters 11 through 12 deal with David's mighty men. Chapters 13 through 15 are really focused on the Ark of the Covenant. Chapter 16 deals with the Levites. 17 through 22 deals with the house, both the making of the temple, but also David's house. 23 through 24 deal with the Levites again. Chapter 25 deals with the priests, which would be loosely connected to the idea of the ark. And then chapters 26 through 27 deals with David's men, this time the armies. So it's loosely there, but I wouldn't force this too much. It's more to help us recall what is in each chapter. In greater detail, chapters 11 through 12 deal with David, his victories over various enemies, and his fighting men. In chapter 13, we have the first attempt of David to bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. This goes very badly, and God breaks out, Perez breaks out against Uzzah, so that the name of the place where he breaks out is called Perez Uzzah. In chapter 14, David has more victories, and instead of talking about his men, he talks about his wives, and God breaks out, once again, Perez, only this time he breaks out against the Philistines. It's interesting, 1 Chronicles is using information that he gets from 2 Samuel chapter 6, but he rearranges the order so that before chapter 13 here in Chronicles should go with chapter 15, because that's what takes place in 2 Samuel chapter 6, with 1 Chronicles 14 actually being 2 Samuel chapter 5. But here, the chronicler, in order to emphasize that David has learned his lesson, rearranges the text. He's allowed to do this, but it is interesting to see him interpret a previous text, so that we have almost a midrash or an interpretation of 2 Samuel 5 and 6 here in 1 Chronicles. The events go part 1 and part 2, but in between we have God, Perez, breaking out against the Philistines. David has learned to rely upon God, and then that's evidenced then in chapter 15. Again, a subtle reminder, or a not so subtle reminder to the Israelite readers reading this book of, hey, you have to rely upon God. Not rely upon superstition, not rely even upon the Ark of the Covenant, but relying upon God and God alone. That is where true victory is found. The focus on David and his house really forms the basis for chapters 16 through 22. We really have two arcs that are taking place here. We have Arc 1, which is building a house. The emphasis in chapter 16 is the Levite worshipers. But in chapter 17, we find out that we're not talking about building God's house. We're actually talking about David's house. And chapters 18, 19, and 20 actually talk about the glory days of David and the victory over the various enemies of David. One glaring omission in this particular set of chapters is found in chapters 19 and 20, which parallels 2 Samuel chapter 10. In chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, we of course have the affair of David with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah the Hittite, and then the fallout. Here in Chronicles, we don't have any mention of Bathsheba or of Uriah the Hittite. Uriah is only mentioned in the list of David's mighty men. There's no backstory at all, even though the chronicler says that it's in the time of the spring when kings go out to war. David sent Joab, as though the chronicler is saying, look, we all know the story, but I'm not going to talk about it. There's a point at which we might say, why? Why does the chronicler not talk about it? Is the chronicler just simply whitewashing the story of David? Is he simply overlooking anything bad because he wants to make David and Judah look really good? Well, the answer to this is fairly simple when we consider that the longing of the chronicler is for the days of David to return, for the fulfillment of the covenant promises of God in chapter 17, as God is promising David, I'm going to build you a house, and your son will sit on the throne forever. As the chronicler is writing, there is no king sitting on the throne, and yet the chronicler is longing for one. He's longing for the son of David to return, and ultimately he's longing for Christ. So as he's saying what he's longing for, he's not going to talk about David's failure because he's not longing for more failure. He's longing for a perfect king who will rule in righteousness. And so it's not that the chronicler is trying to cover up for David. It's that the chronicler is only highlighting those parts of the story of David that he longs to return. In chapter 21, which we'll look at in just a moment, there is the emphasis upon David's sin in counting the people, but there it directly relates to the location of the temple. As it concerns David and Bathsheba and Uriah, there is no impact on the temple, and the chronicler isn't even really interested so much in the paternity of Solomon or the maternity of Solomon as it relates to David and Bathsheba. Instead, the chronicler is simply presenting the Davidic king as the one for whom he longs, a king who will be perfect and will reign in power and might. So in that sense, the chronicler highlights the parts of David that he wishes would return and leaves the other stuff aside. Chapter 21 begins the shift to Ark 2. Where are we going to build this house? Remembering in chapter 17 that the house in question originally was David's house. God is going to build David a house, the same covenant that's established with David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And yet at the same time we do have a mention of an actual house being built, a temple being built, not by David but by his son. The question though is where we're going to build it. In chapter 21, we find out that David, after all of his achievements in chapters 18 through 20, has gotten a little too big for his britches and has gotten quite arrogant. And so he numbers the fighting men, wanting to see how big his army is. This leads to an outbreak of God's judgment against Israel, and in order to avert the plague, David, in chapter 22, goes to the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite and offers a sacrifice. And then at the end of chapter 22 declares, this is where the temple will be built. So now we've answered the question, where are we going to build the actual house? It's not going to be David who's going to build it. We found that out in chapter 17. It's going to be his son, Solomon, who's going to build it. But now we know where. And really, chapter 23, we return to the second part of our chiasm, returning again to Levites and priests. Now that we know where, who's actually going to serve there? Chapter 23 begins answering the question of who's going to serve where. Specifically in chapters 23 through 25, focused on who's going to serve where in the temple. And so we have discussion of gatekeepers, of worshipers, of singers, of Levites, of priests, answering all the questions of who serves where. And yet, interestingly, it's David who is accomplishing this, which is not that out of the question because we saw this all the way back in 1 Chronicles chapter 6 in the genealogy of the Levites. The emphasis was on David or Solomon establishing where the Levites were going to serve. And so we see that pattern here in chapters 23 through 25. In chapters 26 and 27, we have an emphasis not so much on the temple, but on David's administration, on who serves him, who are his men, both his officers, who are the people who are in charge of administrating throughout the land of Israel, but also then who make up his fighting force, not in terms of the mighty men that we saw earlier in the book, but now just David's men. Who is it? What tribes are they from? Who's actually fighting for him? Chapters 28 and 29 are a summary and a charge of David to Israel, related to the temple and what's going to happen in the temple, related to what their behavior is supposed to be. But in chapter 28 and 29, we do have a nice transition from David to Solomon, as he makes it clear who his successor is going to be, and then in chapter 29 dies, so that 2 Chronicles picks up then in chapter 1 with Solomon. And so we have something here in Chronicles that we don't have in Samuel. In Samuel, the succession question is left unanswered at the end of the book, and David is still alive. But nice and neatly here at the end of 1 Chronicles, David is dead, the succession question has been answered, and Solomon is going to take over as king. Just like 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles divides up nicely into two sections. Chapters 1 through 9 are focused on Solomon. Chapters 10 through the rest of the book are focused on the line of kings. Although keep in mind that we're talking specifically about the line of kings of Judah, because the chronicler is focused on his hope in the Davidic line, the covenant promises to David. Many other stories from northern Israel are mentioned if they intersect with the southern kings of Judah. such as the story of Jeroboam and the golden calves, because that relates to Rehoboam and the division of Judah from the rest of Israel. The Levites are also mentioned because they left under Jeroboam, left the northern kingdom, and came to the south, where the true worship of God was taking place. So even though we say chapters 10 through 36 are about the line of kings, it's really only about the line of Judah. And as the book ends, the focus is on the return of the people to Judah, to Jerusalem under King Cyrus, from Babylon. There is no mention of a return from Assyria. Chapters 1 through 9 of 2 Chronicles are focused on Solomon, with the greater part, chapters 2 through 7, focused on the construction of the temple. In chapter 1, Solomon obtains wisdom, in part to build the temple, but also to lead the people of Israel. Solomon did this at Gibeon, where the high place and the altar was, because the Ark of the Covenant had been taken to Jerusalem, but the tabernacle was divided. Some of the tabernacle was in Gibeon, some of the tabernacle, like the Ark of the Covenant, was in Jerusalem. In chapters 2 through 7, the temple itself is built, with a large emphasis on the temple, because the chronicler is hoping either that the temple in his day will be rebuilt, or he's emphasizing that the temple is the dwelling place of God, and he wants Israel to keep the temple that they have potentially rebuilt, depending on when he's writing. In chapter 8, there's an emphasis on Solomon and all of his workers, the workers who built the temple, the workers who work in the temple, the workers who run the temple. And then in chapter 9, we have an emphasis on Solomon, but also the inkling that something is not quite right, because we have a focus on Solomon and his women, and Solomon and his wealth. And we have the mention of the Queen of Sheba, who is also a woman, so that factors into chapter 9 as well. But again, the greater focus in 2 Chronicles as it relates to Solomon is on the temple in chapters 2 through 7. Chapters 10 through 36 transition to the other kings of Israel, beginning in chapter 10 with Solomon's son Rehoboam. According to the chronicler, Rehoboam is evil, although at the beginning of his life he was holy. As the life goes on, he turns from God more and more. So in the end, the chronicler assesses him and says that he was evil in the eyes of God. The same with chapter 13, where we have Abiah, who seems to be suggested by the chronicler to be good, and yet in the book of Kings, it's not Abiah, A-B-I-J-A-H, it's actually Abijam, A-B-I-J-A-M. And in Kings, Abijam is assessed as evil. The chronicler never comes out right and says that Abiah is good, but he does seem to imply that he's good. He gives a greater view of holiness to Abiah than the writer of Kings does, which is pretty typical of the chronicler. He seems to have a pretty rosy picture of some of these kings in terms of their holiness. He's far more positive on most of them than the writer of Kings is, which is why it is fascinating that there isn't necessarily a positive assessment of Solomon. King Asa is said to be entirely good in chapter 15, even though his story runs from 14 through 16, and in chapter 16 we see Asa actually turning against the prophet of God, which then raises the question, how could he be entirely good? Again, the chronicler has a very positive assessment. The same in chapters 17 through 20, a positive assessment of Jehoshaphat, especially as it relates to Jehoshaphat's work in the temple, and yet the final assessment is that Jehoshaphat joined with Ahab, both in battle and in a situation involving ships. The ships were destroyed because Jehoshaphat was not supposed to have an allegiance with Ahab, which again raises this question as to, well, how good was he? But is consistent with the chronicler having a general positive view of these kings, even when the writer of Kings has a more negative view. Chapter 21 has King Jehoram. In the book of Kings, he is King Joram, and yet it doesn't matter what you call him. Chronicles and Kings are both in agreement that he was evil, because he was married to a daughter of Ahab. That makes his son Azariah in chapter 22, the grandson of Ahab. Athaliah is Azariah's mother, that is Jehoram's wife, the queen mother of Azariah, but also the queen wife of Jehoram. It gets a little confusing here because after Azariah is killed in the north by Jehu, his mother, the wife of Jehoram, becomes the queen, the only queen in Israel's history, and she reigns in Judah for 7 years. But Azariah's son, Joash, who is Jehoram's grandson, Joash is good and will eventually become king under the rulership of Jehoiada, the priest, who leads Joash in executing Athaliah and taking over as king. Joash is under Jehoiada's care for 7 years in the temple until he becomes king. Sadly, in chapter 24, Joash will turn on the son of Jehoiada, actually putting him to death as he serves as a prophet, telling Joash that he needs to repent. Amaziah is Joash's son. Amaziah is good, but near the end of his life he turns to idolatry, in which case he is not good, not entirely good. So he's good, but not good like his father David, and not good consistently. His son, Uzziah, is very good, but Uzziah will eventually become arrogant and attempt to go into the temple and offer incense when he's not supposed to, in which case he'll be struck with leprosy and he'll be a leper for the rest of his life. Uzziah is probably most famous for Isaiah chapter 6, in the year that King Uzziah died. That's the king of Judah, in whose year Isaiah is called. As Uzziah dies, we realize that God is the one upon the throne. In chapter 27, we read that Uzziah's son Jotham was a good, righteous man. However, we're also told in chapter 27 that the people were corrupt. Even though Jotham was good, the people were not. So it's no surprise then in chapter 28 that we get an evil king. The people naturally go along with the evil king because they themselves are already corrupt. That king is Ahaz, and we're told in Isaiah that Ahaz is the king during the sign of Emmanuel, as Ahaz reaches out to the Assyrians to come and attack Israel and the Syrians. Tiglath-Pileser comes and actually takes Israel into captivity. They don't come back the way that they come back from Babylon. They instead trickle back over the next several hundred years. But that is the end of the northern kingdom during the reign of Ahaz and Hezekiah. Ahaz does not trust in God. He does not ask for a sign, which is why Isaiah gives him the sign of Emmanuel, telling him that he is going to be delivered before the son is old enough to know the difference between right and wrong. More than likely, the son that Isaiah has in mind is in chapter 8, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, who is the son of the prophetess. Before Maher-shalal-Hashbaz becomes the son old enough to know right and wrong, Israel is defeated by Assyria. Matthew, of course, picks this up in Matthew and tells us that this is also the sign of Emmanuel pointing to Christ. Hezekiah becomes king in chapter 29, and the emphasis on him runs all the way through chapter 32. He is a very good king. Initially, he makes a treaty with Egypt and revolts against Assyria, which leads to an Assyrian invasion under Sennacherib, but that ends with the death of all of Sennacherib's army outside the walls of Jerusalem. Hezekiah at that point only has one city, Jerusalem. But he establishes that city, trusts in God, and God delivers them, and then makes it into a great kingdom again. Although then it goes to his head, and he begins to brag to the Babylonians about how many he has in his storehouses. Isaiah comes and tells him everything that was in your storehouses will eventually end up in Babylon. Surprisingly, for as good as Hezekiah is as a king, he has a wicked son named Manasseh, who is the most evil of all the kings of Judah. But unlike in the book of Kings, in the book of Chronicles, Manasseh actually repents and is restored. He ends up for a time captive in Babylon before coming back to Judah and reigning in his repentance. So there's a slight overlap between Manasseh and Josiah, where Manasseh is actually good. Josiah is very good, although Josiah will eventually die by going out and opposing Pharaoh Necho. Necho is on his way to link up with the Assyrians, who are then going to fight in the Battle of Carchemish against the Babylonians, where the Assyrians and the Egyptians will be defeated. This is the point at which the Babylonians become the world power. But Josiah does not want Necho going through the territory of Israel. Possibly, at that point, Josiah is in league with the Babylonians and feels the need to stop Necho and the Assyrians. There's a conversation, though, between Pharaoh Necho and Josiah, where Pharaoh Necho says that God has sent him, which is interesting since he's then defeated. But he tells Josiah that if Josiah comes against him, he will have to kill Josiah, because Josiah will be opposing God. That's exactly what happens. odd discussion in the mouth of a pagan pharaoh, and yet the writer of Chronicles seems to believe that what the pharaoh was saying was true, that actually God had talked to Pharaoh and had told Josiah not to oppose Pharaoh. He doesn't listen, and he's killed. It's a shame because Josiah was a great king, and his sons will certainly not be. Chapter 36 is the close of 2 Chronicles, and it is a fast decline. We come from Jehoahaz to Jehoiakim to Jehoiakin to Zedekiah, one bad relative and descendant of Josiah after another. All four are wicked. And yet chapter 36 summarizes it by telling us that the problem is not political. It's not just that these four kings were not good kings. The issue is spiritual. They do not follow after God, and as such they are each punished in turn. There is a note of hope, though, at the end of 2 Chronicles, which again is why Chronicles often is placed at the end of the Old Testament in Hebrew Bibles. There is a note of hope because Cyrus allows the exiles to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. So there is an element of hope as the book ends. All is not completely lost, and yet it has been a complete downhill trajectory, much like the book of Judges. We've had reprieves, but at the end we're at the bottom. We've hit rock bottom. And it is here that the chronicler finds himself, perhaps having returned under Cyrus, but not yet having built the temple, since no temple is mentioned, or perhaps shortly after the building of the temple, and yet things are still quite bleak in Israel, leading the chronicler to hope and to long for the coming king. One of the important questions to consider when examining an Old Testament book is why that particular author felt the need to write. Why does 1st and 2nd Chronicles need to be written if the same information can be found in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings? Well, the answer really has to do with the longing of the chronicler. He is longing for the true king, and he is longing for the true worship of God. Perhaps in the temple, if the temple's not yet been built, but even in a temple that has been built, the presence of God that is foreseen by Ezekiel coming back to the temple doesn't appear to have returned. The greater glory that Haggai speaks of has not yet returned. Malachi bemoans the fact that true worship is not taking place and says that it would be better to close the doors of the temple than to allow the fake worship, the improper worship, to continue. So the chronicler is longing for the return of the true Davidic king. He's longing for the return of true worship, perhaps the first time for true worship to appear in Israel. And yet neither have truly happened at the time that he is writing. So as he's writing 1st and 2nd Chronicles, he's calling his readers to remember what it is that they should be focused upon. They should be focused on that future Davidic king in fulfillment of 1st Chronicles chapter 17, 2nd Samuel 7, the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. They should be longing for true worship, when the people worship in the temple the way that they're supposed to worship. This is what the chronicler desires and longs for, making it an appropriate book as he refocuses those two themes, not just simply as history, telling us the story of David, but really focusing us on why the story of David is important, pointing us ahead, ultimately, to Christ. It has long been tradition to view Ezra and Nehemiah as a single book, and there is good reason to think that they originally were one book. We've already said that tradition says that Chronicles was written by Ezra, with Nehemiah finishing that work later. Ezra is not claimed to be the author of Ezra, nor does he write in the first person. However, it is considered tradition that Ezra wrote most of Ezra, with Nehemiah filling in the later information. Nehemiah also writes his own book in the first person, which is different from Ezra, written in the third person. Ezra is a priest who returns to Jerusalem in 458 BC. The first exiles returned to Jerusalem in 538 BC, so quite a bit earlier, and the temple itself is completed in 515 BC. So it is long after the temple has been completed that Ezra returns, and yet the book originally is set between 538 and 458 BC, in that time when the rebuilding takes place, with then more chapters taking place after 458, as Ezra deals with the situation after his return that exists in Jerusalem spiritually. Ezra also appears later in the book of Nehemiah, which suggests that the book of Ezra was probably written sometime after perhaps 440 or 430 even BC. We really don't know, though, other than that it's probably much later after the time that he actually returned to Jerusalem in 458. Ezra chapter 4 verse 8 through chapter 6 verse 18, and again chapter 7 verses 12 through 26 are all actually written in Aramaic, because these are the letters back and forth between Persian officials, as has been recorded for us here in the book of Ezra. Surprisingly, Ezra doesn't appear until chapter 7. Again, chapter 7 dealing with 458 BC, everything else in the book dealing with a later time, from the first return of the exiles under Cyrus in 538 up until that time that Ezra arrives in 458, and then sometime afterwards until Ezra or some other author, perhaps Nehemiah, again writes down the final information of the ministry of Ezra, both in the book of Ezra and in the book of Nehemiah. Chapters 1 through 2 of the book of Ezra deal with the return of the exiles to Jerusalem, again in 538, under the command of Cyrus. He allows them to go back and commands that they rebuild the temple. In Ezra chapter 3, they do begin the rebuild, but in Ezra chapter 4, we see a resistance, so the work stops. Until in chapter 5, through the ministry of Haggai and the prophet Zechariah, we again see the resumption of the rebuilding. And then finally, in chapter 6, that process is complete. The temple is rebuilt. We see the people responding to the building of the temple and the restoration then of the worship of God in Jerusalem. Chapters 7 and 8 deal with Ezra finally arriving on the scene, again 458 BC, since the year is given as the 7th year of the emperor in Persia, allowing us to date what year exactly this takes place. It's his travel and his arrival, but then chapters 9 through 10 deal with the issues that exist when he returns. And we don't have a specific indication of how long that process takes after he returns, of him dealing with the issues in Israel. It may have simply taken a few months, it may have taken a few years, which is why it's a little difficult to say when exactly the book of Ezra is written, but we do know that the book is written and completed before he actually passes away, since, much like 1st and 2nd Samuel, he's alive at the end of the book, and there's no indication that he's going to die anytime soon. Chapters 9 and 10 really deal with the question of intermarriage and repentance, since many of the people who were exiles and have returned have actually intermarried with foreigners, both when they were in Babylon and in Persia, but also after the return. And Ezra 9 through 10 really deals with the repentance. It's interesting because the repentance seems to be divorce, of actually putting away those foreign wives, which raises all sorts of questions as to whether or not that's merciful and gracious, and to whether or not purity is so important as to do and undertake divorce in order to establish it. So there's great discussion to take place there as to how seriously they take that purity, to the point that they're willing to actually get rid of wives and even children and put them away in order to restore the purity of the people of Israel. As has already been mentioned, Nehemiah and Ezra originally traveled as one book, two authors each writing their part, but traveling together. Ezra appears in the book of Nehemiah, but Nehemiah does not appear in the book of Ezra, which suggests that when Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem in 444 BC, the book of Ezra had already been completed. Ezra appears in Nehemiah, especially in Nehemiah chapter 8, as Ezra reads the law. Nehemiah then records Ezra in his book, because that's taking place after 444 BC. Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the emperor or the king of the Persians. He is a very high-ranking official, a high government official, which is why he is able to serve then as the governor of the Judean province when he returns to Jerusalem. Nehemiah is arriving in Jerusalem in 444 BC. He returns after about 12 years. He returns to Persia around 423 BC, and then at some later time comes back a second time to Jerusalem. Unfortunately, he finds that many of his reforms from the first time he was present are not continuing when he returns. We also notice that Ezra, while mentioned in the earlier parts of Nehemiah, is not mentioned at the end, especially in Nehemiah's second visit to Jerusalem, so that by the end of the book, Nehemiah is the sole responsible governor and spiritual leader of the people of Israel. The problem that originally presents within the book of Nehemiah is the fact that the walls have been torn down, and yet as the book continues, we realize that the issue is not just with the walls, the issue is with the spiritual condition of Israel. which again is part of the reform that is brought about then by Ezra and Nehemiah, later just Nehemiah. The walls are rebuilt, the physical protection of Israel is reestablished, but the spiritual concerns continue to plague Israel. There's a covenant that is made with the hopes that that will stem the tide, as it were, of the spiritual decay once again, and yet by the time Nehemiah comes back, it looks that that has not been the case. Hopefully, in the time that follows after the book of Nehemiah, there are reforms that continue to take place so that the people do become the righteous people that they are called to be, but that is not really the outlook or the positive signs that exist within the book of Nehemiah itself. Nehemiah 1 through 4 deals with the problem and the response to that problem, the problem being that the walls are in ruins. The response is Nehemiah traveling to Jerusalem in order to rebuild those walls, coming, as I said, in 444 BC. There is resistance to the rebuilding of the walls, especially in chapter 4, and yet, unlike in the book of Ezra, that resistance is not successful. The enemies of Israel attempt to stop the walls from being rebuilt, but unlike the people in the days of the beginning of the book of Ezra, from 538 BC on to 515 BC, Nehemiah is such a high-ranking official that he doesn't really listen to anybody. Whereas in the book of Ezra, those initial returns to Jerusalem have to wait to get permission to continue their work of construction from the Persian authorities. Nehemiah, though, is operating as the governor under the authority of the emperor. Because Nehemiah is a cupbearer, he has such political clout that he doesn't feel the need to stop and wait. And so the resistance fails. In chapter 5, there's the problem of oppressing the poor, and so Nehemiah interacts with the people to make sure that that stops. They're oppressing the Levites to such a point that the Levites have to stop being priests in order to take care of their own fields. Nehemiah puts an end to that right away. In chapter 6, there is more resistance, this time directly aimed at Nehemiah, and the response is to remain faithful and to complete the work that God has given him. In chapter 7, we have a list of returnees to the people of Israel in Jerusalem. This list is very similar to the first two chapters of the book of Ezra, and the numbers add up to be the same, at least in terms of the total, but how we actually get there is a little different. Likely, Nehemiah's list is an update of Ezra's list, Nehemiah's list including those who have been born since the return, so that the number is still the same of the people who actually returned, but Nehemiah is giving us more information than of subsequent generations. This would explain the problem between the two lists. There are people listed in Ezra and Nehemiah that are the same, but there are people listed in Nehemiah that are not in Ezra. So this would explain why Nehemiah is including that later generation. In Nehemiah chapter 8, Ezra reads the law. Not just reading the law, he actually, it says, gives its sense. In other words, Ezra preaches on the law. Some people have referred to this as one of the first sermons, where Ezra is not only reading the law of God, but expounding upon it. Chapters 9 through 10 then are the response of the people to the reading and preaching of God's word. They form a covenant and say that they're going to follow all that Ezra has read in the law. Chapter 11 deals with the inhabitants of those who are going to live in Jerusalem. Many of the people return to their ancestral lands, but Jerusalem needs to be filled, and so people are elected from each tribe, including many of the peoples that have returned from Assyria, trickling back, not so much in a great wave the way that they do coming back from Babylon, but coming back little by little, enough that many of them do live in Jerusalem. Chapter 12, again, is a list, this time a list of the priests, and the dedication of the walls. The walls have now been rebuilt. They are dedicated. It has been established. And then in chapter 13, perhaps after Nehemiah has gone back to Persia, to Susa, and then comes back sometime later, perhaps around 423 BC, comes back to find that there are some issues still going on spiritually in Jerusalem. There needs to be some reforms, and so he undertakes those to make sure that the people are treating one another correctly, that the Sabbath is being observed and followed, and that the people are no longer intermarrying. It's a little distressing to see the intermarriage issue creep up again, because that was the same issue that existed in the book of Ezra, and yet it appears to have resumed, or at least taken over again, perhaps simply continued, although it seems as though they did indeed put away the people they were supposed to for a time, but now they have begun once again to intermarry with the people that are around them, which was strictly forbidden and which the Jews took very seriously after Nehemiah came and did his reform. We see that later on, even in Jewish history, where they are very careful to preserve the purity of the people of Israel, both in terms of bloodline, but also spiritually. Again, a summary of some things we have seen in the book of Nehemiah. We see first-person prayers being offered quite a bit in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah saying things to God and then recording them in the first hand. We do see that number of differences between Ezra and Nehemiah, and yet a number of similarities as well, which again gives credence to the theory that Nehemiah is building off of Ezra's writings, completing, as it were, some of his book. We see the preaching of the law of God in Nehemiah chapter 8, an important development for the people since not all of them speak Hebrew. They speak Aramaic, so the law of God in Hebrew actually has to be explained to them, but it's expounded upon and it's preached. And we also see the problem with Samaritans in the book of Nehemiah because of the opposition that takes place to the building of the walls is primarily by Samaritans. This gives some of the background for why Samaritans are not liked very well in the Israelite nation, especially at the time of Christ, and yet this goes back some 440 years. We also see the problem with foreigners and intermarriage, and so Ezra and Nehemiah really give background for why the Jews were so adamant about maintaining their purity after this time. And we see an element on hope, that there is hope for the people of Israel, even after return from exile. Even there is forgiveness. There is the beginning of restoration. There is the rebuilding, and then there is that ongoing hope that God is going to fulfill his promises to his people. The book of Esther is a book of peculiarities. We have the story of Esther where we read it and we think, wait a minute? You mean Esther actually spent the night with the king? And I don't think they were just playing cards or watching TV. She actually spent the night with the king. And this is praised, that she's beautiful and that she spends the night with the king and pleases him with all the double entendres and insinuations that involves, and gets called back and becomes queen. So again, the story is very odd. God is not mentioned at all in the book, except in passing. It's very much a book about human agency, and yet, for such a time as this, God has raised Esther up, which is emphasized throughout the book. We see the institution of the Jewish festival of Purim, the casting of lots. It's interesting that because this particular festival is only mentioned in the book of Esther and is not mentioned anywhere else, many of those, especially in the Dead Sea Scroll community at Qumran, did not like the book of Esther. So because of that, we find every book of the Old Testament, at least fragments of it, at Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls, except the book of Esther. This book is not found among the Dead Sea Scrolls because, them being purists, they did not appreciate that Purim is not mentioned in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses. They viewed it as almost an extra-biblical festival and did not appreciate that there was a book of the Old Testament calling for it to be followed. So Esther is a very interesting, fascinating book, obviously emphasizing the involvement of people in the plans and purposes of God of preserving his people, and yet God remains behind the scenes. The focus is on the people. And then as well, just the craziness of the story that takes place until eventually we have a Jewish queen, Esther. We have a Jewish magistrate in Mordecai taking over and running in the name of the emperor. All ends well. But boy, does it take an odd series of events to get there. The book of Ruth is another unusual book. We have almost a reenacting of Abraham and the Exodus, where the people, because of a famine, have gone out of Israel, out of the land of promise, have gone off to the land of Moab, have in a sense become captive, although that's not as emphasized quite as much, but they're sojourning in that land, much like Abraham in Egypt. And then they come out of that land where they are sojourning and return to the promised land. Only this time the foreigner is not Abraham, it's the Moabitess. It's Ruth. Ruth coming to the land of promise, where she indeed is joined to the people of promise. And she comes because this is where rest is found. It's interesting, Naomi tries to convince her that there is no rest for her in the promised land because rest is found in the house of her husband, and there will be no husband for her if she comes with Naomi. She should stay among her own people and find a husband. And yet, Ruth demonstrates her faith that actually true rest is found in Israel. So the focus on Abraham and the Israelites coming out of Egypt and finding rest in God in the promised land is mirrored greatly in Ruth. Ruth comes, she gleans. It appears at a time that she's not supposed to, because we're told it's at the beginning of the barley harvest, whereas they're supposed to glean at the end of the harvest. She seems to not know that or to not care. Naomi seems to not care to instruct her. She just simply tells Ruth, yeah, whatever, go glean. She waits and asks for permission, and it almost appears as though the serving men of Boaz don't know what to tell her, because she's waiting, trying to find out if she's allowed to go glean. And Boaz tells her, not only can you glean, but you can actually glean among the harvesters. You don't even have to stay by the other gleaners. You can glean among the young women and take whatever you want. And then instructs his young men to deliberately leave things behind so that she can glean it. And she gleans, if you want to call it gleaning, an incredible amount of food for her and Naomi. We see really Boaz being an instrument of God's faithfulness here to Naomi and to Ruth. And Ruth goes and eventually takes refuge in Boaz and does find rest in the people of God and in Boaz, and then produces the king who is going to be King David eventually after several generations. We also have an emphasis on the kinsman redeemer, although the kinsman redeemer here is not quite as much of a focus as it is often made out to be. Just because the name is redeemer doesn't mean that this is necessarily a focus on Christ as the redeemer, but the kinsman redeemer does play a large part in this particular book, so that the name of the dead man is carried on, and yet the name that is actually emphasized is Boaz. Boaz and Ruth, and even though the name of the dead sons, Mahlon and Chilion, are supposed to be continued, they're no longer mentioned. Instead, the focus becomes on Naomi and Ruth and Boaz and their son, who is going to eventually give birth to Jesse, and Jesse giving birth then to David. So we have the emphasis upon generations that takes place, and yet not the previous generation, which was the whole purpose of kinsman redeemer to begin with, to preserve that name. And so some interesting changes to the story that from what we would necessarily expect, but yet an emphasis on the role of Boaz redeeming Ruth, redeeming Naomi, redeeming the land, continuing the purposes of the family line through Judah, but eventually all the way down to David. David then is the descendant of a Moabite, which has given all sorts of interesting theories to arise in Israel as ways around that. And yet the text does not shy away from that. Instead, there's a complete book on it, that David is descended from Ruth, a Moabitess. It appears that because Ruth joined into Israel, she's no longer considered a Moabitess, even though she's sometimes referred to that way in the book of Ruth, but that ultimately she became part of Israel and found rest in the people of Israel, a rest that then is continued on to David. Well, that brings us to the end of the historical books. We've covered Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Esther, and Ruth in this particular lesson. Hopefully you have grasped the main themes and the structure of each book. I look forward to discussing them more with you in detail.